If you,
So I'm privileged today to be joined with Michael Carroll, a friend of mine that we've been discussing topics on the faith for the last number of years, especially around this concept or theology of union with God, theosis, deification, and we've been back and forth with many ideas. And today, Michael, we've finally agreed to do an interview to at least to tease out this for to get the church thinking of how we can resolve the crisis in the faith. Because you've written a few books on this now, and you've studied it. And I just thought if you could just maybe condense to us in 5 minutes what you've studied, what are your thoughts on the crisis, and where we can go after the crisis in the church.
yeah, no, okay. Right, so it's great to speak to you, Robert. And obviously, we've been talking quite a bit. I'm from Poland. And yes, so basically, I came into this through the Carmelite route. And effectively, around about the time when Summorum Pontificum was, published, I'd sort of, I already knew that what I might say is that I was really pleased with the Latin Mass. I went to Latin Mass and I understood that the truth was there. But at the back of my mind, there was always this element that was worrying me. And the thing that was worrying me was, well, we've got the liturgical tradition, but there doesn't seem to be a spiritual tradition attached to it. And as time went on, obviously it became, it was already apparent that there was a crisis in the church, and from quite a, from like 15 years ago, I understood it wasn't just a liturgical crisis; it was a spiritual crisis, and in many cases they talk about that there is a war on contemplation, but really there is a war on the whole of the spiritual tradition from 2,000 years. And what we really see is that, um, right, so what I'm going to say, I'm just going to mention this, but I need to say something beforehand because I don't want people to get me wrong on what I'm saying. So I'm fully on board if people want to study scholasticism, obviously the Dominican line, but also the Franciscan line from Bonaventure, which is also mentioned in Eterna Patri. It's not just Thomas Aquinas, but it's also Bonaventure. And these studies should uh, continue. I've got no problem with scholasticism. But the problem is that 700 years ago, there was a problem in terms of taking spiritual teachings and manualizing them. And effectively, what happened was 700 years later, we ended up, and I'm talking before Vatican II, we ended up with manualized spiritual teachings that were good. I'm not totally criticizing this approach, because obviously this approach actually fits into what we're going to talk about, which is the three stages of the spiritual life. It is actually part of it. But when you start going down the line of if you do X, Y, and Z, then you will get to heaven, then something has been missed somewhere. And I think it's worth mentioning that, and I think a lot of traditionalists don't understand this, that Leo the 13th produced 10 encyclicals, which were supposed to really reboot Christendom. They tried to reboot Christendom before, and it didn't quite work in the past, before the time of Leo XIII. And he produced these 10 um, encyclicals, and I think some traditionalists are on board with this, and then others have never even heard of it. And so, whatever they're told online is what they believe. And so what we've got to do, and some of these encyclicals involve what is when we get to the heart of the Holy Spirit, what are we talking about? And also to keep the Thomism, but an applied Thomism in a way. It's like, by all means, study scholasticism, but what does the teaching mean? And at the heart of the Summa Theologica is the 3 stages of the spiritual life. And if you start to so you might be involved in a research area that has a specific area to do with the virtues or whatever to do with Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica. But if you start divorcing this from the key teaching in the Summa Theologica, which is there are 3 stages that we have to move through, then, and the 3rd stage is perfection, then the wheels are going to start coming off the cart. And really, this is sort of what we've seen. And so I do want to say at this point that I was actually a representative for the Latin Mass Society, and Joseph Shaw even made me a trustee for a very short while. I wasn't able to do it for a very, very long time. So as far as I'm concerned, very good. I'm fully on board with the Latin Mass. When I live in Poland, I go to the new Mass and the Latin Mass. It's different in Poland, as you may appreciate. But we need to start telling the true story. And the true story is that somehow over 700 years, not just mysticism, but we also have to think about how these 3 stages were in the patristic age as well, because they were there early on. And so we have to for this crisis to be healed. The truth of the matter is that traditionalists are not. It's not their fault. Actually, if there are any traditionalists listening, I'm not having a go at traditionalists. I am having a go at certain traditionalist leaders who have maybe not got a balanced view of 2,000 years worth of teaching, and who have omitted these teachings of the 3 stages of the spiritual life and mysticism. But we've also got to look from it. So I've noticed the traditionalists now, they've realized they've made a mistake, and so they're automatically going to these esoteric teachings of the Middle Ages, mysticism. And that's all very well and good, but we need the patristic, but we also need the modern, which is Father Garrigou Lagrange, Father Arentero, and Father Tanqueray. And when we start putting this picture together, then the crisis in the church will be healed, and there will be, and I'm going to go as far to say, I'll stop talking in a moment, I'll say there could even be a rebirth of the church, because we're going to have the true teaching that leads to union with God. And I'll just leave it at there for now. So, if you want me to add anything else, I'm quite happy to do that.
Yeah, no, and again, I suppose our listeners need to understand, we've had a lot of conversation over a number of years on this topic, back and forth. And again, we're not here to bash the traditional movement. I'm not here to bash any movement in the church. I want to kind of people to understand we love the faith, and we're trying to understand how we move forward from this crisis in the church, how we are able to evangelize anew. I mean, this is a labor of love. This isn't a conversation to divide the church in any shape or form. But the traditionalist movement has proposed itself, saying, look, we have the fullness of the faith. We have everything here. You come with us and you're going to heaven. We are the savior of the church. That's one side that we're getting. And on the other side, we have another movement that is very much activist based. You just have to love. We don't need all of these old symbols of traditional Latin Mass. And in the midst of all of these 2 movements, we're forgetting that what is Christ asking us to do is, like St. Paul is telling us, be imitators of me. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And what is this teaching that Christ left us is to become other Christs, and at the end of the day, to have this complete union with God, to be transformed by Him. And I think you made it, one of your messages to me really impacted me one day, and you said, true contemplation, true union with God can't happen without love of other.
Mhm.
And it said to me, you really get it. You really understood it, because union with God cannot happen without loving as Christ loved, loving the other as Christ loved. This is the everything everything that the church is giving us, in my opinion, the sacraments and everything, is to transform us so that we love like Christ. We are transformed by love to love like Christ. I mean, I've been turning this around for years in my mind, studying as much as I can on this, because Vatican II, Lumen Gentium, universal call to holiness, and yet has the church ever really kind of defined what holiness is? It's not just pious on a Sunday go to mass. It's not just we act nice. It's far, far, far deeper, in my opinion. And I think you're drawing on this because you've studied in depth Vatican II. There's no doubt about it. It comes through in your books. I suppose, how can we repropose this um, tradition? Because this is the living tradition of the church. How can we show people this tradition anew in the modern world?
Right. Okay. Well, to get to that point, you've sort of got to start. I've got to start at the beginning, because if I'm saying, people won't believe me if I don't go through the process. So the first thing I say is, if you don't believe that this does not, what we're talking about does not make up the tradition, then you've got to ask, there was a divine order set in place by God. And what we've got to do is we've got to get back to this divine order. And it's not me saying this, it's the church fathers. And the church fathers say that um, when we go through this, the path, uh, what we might call now union with God, what we end up is restoring the way we were in the Garden of Eden, and we come to where Adam and Eve were. How Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden. And actually, the Orthodox actually go a bit further, that we can be even more. We never reach perfection, but they're even more adamant about this. And um, and the church fathers, even St. Augustine says this. So this means two things: that not only are we restoring the divine order within us, but we're also then helping to restore the divine order when we come into contact with all those things around us. And I
Yes.
think that maybe, remembering I go to Latin Mass, I've organised many Latin Masses, but what traditions don't always understand is that to restore the divine order is not about getting the buildings back from Christendom. It's about building the heavenly Jerusalem on earth, and that is through the soul, and the soul is the heart. And this is the place of the Holy Trinity. And I know what you want me to get to. You also want me to get to love of neighbour. And I think that there is this tension in the church between, we've got to go to Mass and we've got to love God, and maybe the poor are not so important in this issue, but we've got the divine order to restore. And so if we restore the divine order, not only will we get true worship of God, but we will also get true love of neighbour. Now, it is true that when we talk about love of neighbour, when we help people, so if we help the poor, it is true we help them, as Francis de Sales says, we help them get back on their feet, but we also show them that this providence that they've experienced, they had come from God. So we are trying to get them in the direction of God as well. but it's not about restoring the buildings. I mean, hopefully we might get the buildings back one day. You know, hopefully we will get Christendom back one day. But there's only one way if we're going to do that, and that is through going through the 3 stages of the spiritual life. And the sooner everybody in the church starts engaging with this, the sooner it will happen, because it is a process. You cannot speed this process up in an individual any faster than God will make it happen. But if you do engage with the process and you want to reach union with God, which is pretty, you know, we go through the purgative stage, the illuminative stage, and the unitive stage. And what we've got to remember is the unitive stage is Christian perfection. It is the stage of Christian perfection. And it's also the stage of what is known as spiritual childhood. So you must become as little children, and you know, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And you know, I would say Pius XII is very good on this, talking about the perfection of virtue. Well, that perfection of virtue, perfection of charity, even the evangelical perfections. These are all things that start to be perfected in the unitive stage. And without this, there is no end to the crisis in the church. Now, I don't know if you were going to ask me, are you going to ask me later how we get to do this? How we go around, get to doing this, or shall I mention that now?
I think one of the things you said about the Christ in the church, and you said regarding the selection of bishops, is that they should always be in the unitive stage. You know, especially, you know, a superior in a monastery or a bishop, somebody in a position of leadership in the church should be in that stage of their spiritual formation. And that's not happening in the church. We know that for a fact. You know, I was in one of the largest, most promoted congregations in the Church, the Legions of Christ, and our leader, the founder, de facto was not ever in that unitive stage. And how could he form us into to union with God? You know, thankfully he just plagiarized a lot of good practices which helped us fortify our life, but in theory we were just swimming around the moat of the castle that Saint Teresa is talking about, without ever being drawn into what she was calling us to. Do you, if you want to touch on that, because I think unless there you go, you're
Sorry,
back there. Somebody calling.
So yeah, so sorry about that. I can't. I don't know how to sort it, so I can't get video calls. It was difficult. So right. So what you were saying there is about every bishop should be in the unitive stage. So right. So it's more than that. Every bishop should be in the unitive stage, and well, it's best practice for them to be in the unitive stage. And it's also a priest should be, when they leave seminary, they should be in the illuminative stage. Now, what I've got to do is just go slightly back to the beginning again, so that we've got the full lineage of the path. So it's not Michael Carroll saying this.
Correct.
It's the Theologica saying this. It's St. Thomas saying this. It was most recently, we were all reminded of this by Father Gary Gouda-Grange in 3 stages of the spiritual life, 3 ages of the spiritual life. But this has not come out of thin air, and we have to be honest. Now, if people want to say Vatican II is no good, well, that's fair enough, and they can do whatever they want. But there has to be some academic integrity, and there has to be some honesty. And the facts are that Vatican II does call, before I get on to bishops, it calls everyone to Christian perfection.
Yep.
And all the synonyms that are associated with the mystical theology, associated with the 3 stages of the spiritual life. So abandonment to divine will, Christian perfection, perfection of virtue, perfection of charity, perfection of love, Don't let anybody ever tell you that perfection of love is some sort of a liberal concept, because it isn't. It's straight out of St. Augustine. And these things are mentioned explicitly 57 times, and they are explicit. And in Vatican II, bishops are called to Christian perfection. So it's not even the Summa Theologica, okay? And we've gone, you see, the irony is that we're told how bad Vatican II is. But before Vatican II, we were only told by the Summa Theologica and certain documents that a priest and a bishop should be in the purgative or the in the unitive of the illuminative stage. But it's Vatican II that actually takes the Thomistic teaching that bishops and priests should be, and religious should bind themselves to the things of perfection. And the theme of Christian perfection is throughout. But when we take those references to contemplation, because you cannot separate contemplation from the three stages of the spiritual life, because it's implicit to the illuminative stage. And so this is about honesty. Now, I'm not saying I've answered every aspect of Vatican II, because there are other aspects, but we have to be honest, and it's there. Now, but there is another element that has been missed. In my studies, the last thing I had to do was find out whether the apostles attained Christian perfection on the day of Pentecost. And I thought there was no way I was ever going to find this. Now, the apostles are obviously the first bishops. And the idea of this teaching is that the apostles were the first bishops, and so that our bishops should have the characteristics of the first bishops of the church. And what I discovered was that St. Augustine, St. Chrysostom, to be honest, it was it was more than you thought. I couldn't believe it when I saw it, because the church fathers basically said the apostles were in attained Christian perfection on the day of Pentecost. I know some theologians know this, but you have to take this information and you've got to integrate it all together so you understand. So I'm going to say the first thing that I'm going to go on to now is that if there had been priests formed in the three stages of the spiritual life, it was less likely that an abuse crisis would have happened in the church. I'm not as naive to say it was going to be a perfect sort of silver bullet or whatever they call it, but it's if priests had been taught the three stages of the spiritual life in seminary, I'm just going to say it, it's highly likely that there would have been an abuse crisis. You would never stamp out all this, but that is worth mentioning. And to cut a long story short, and I will get to this at the end, it's quite clear that seminary teaching must include the three stages of the spiritual life. It must be a pastoral teaching. It must be a teaching that they understand. It can't be too esoteric. It can't be too scholastic. You've got to you've got to make it pastoral so they understand it.
Yeah.
But this is what's going to bring about it's going to stop the crisis. But of course, Vatican II, ironically, now calls everybody to Christian perfection.
Yes,
Universal
it
Call to
does.
Holiness. Now, I know for a fact, because I've been online and I've said this on X, as it's called now. I don't have anything to do with the internet now, but then Taylor Marshall came in to me and said, "Oh, but Christ always called us to the universal call to holiness." But, well, there's obviously something not right in the church. So obviously this universal call to holiness has not been taken up, and I don't think it was really taken up before Vatican II. We had better teachings. But look, you wanted me to talk about union with God and loving our neighbour. So when we restore the divine order, what Saint Teresa says, and other teachers say, is that we do not know when we are loving God. So when we're at Mass, we might be thinking we love God a lot because we're very fervent. But, there might be somebody, so we might be praying in our heads, as we might say, vocal prayers, and we might be doing very fervently, but there might be somebody further along that might be having infused contemplation. Because I know people who have had infused contemplation at Mass. So who's loving God more? I'm sure they're loving God equally, but we don't know when we love God. And, if we're going to Mass and being very pious, but we're not loving our neighbor, we're not loving God. And so what this 3 stages of the spiritual life is, what on the path to union with God is, it teaches us to restore with correct balance that we go to Mass, we give correct worship, we love God, we do all the right things to God, we amend our lives. And this amendment of life is really supposed to be quite fervent in the purgative stage, far more than they're saying. You've really got to fight the sin in the purgative stage. It's just the fact, and nobody's saying this. And so people, as John of the Cross would basically say, he might not say it quite in these terms, but people are not getting beyond the dark night of the senses. But we'll talk about that later. But you've got to get into your illuminative stage. And but these consolations in prayer, like contemplation, they're not just for consolation. It's so that we are taught to. We go up the holy mountain, and sometimes God withdraws himself, and sometimes he's present. And when he withdraws himself, we try and find him, and we try and get back into contemplation, and then he comes back, and we have the consolation. But we keep going up the mountain. I can explain this more later. But when God withdraws himself in the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the spirits, and this is the key, and I'm sorry, I'll be quick. What we learn is that we don't have that help that we had in the past. For some people, this might be very simple. It might be dryness in prayer, but for others, God may remove his help. Maybe because he's teaching you a lesson, because you haven't been holy. And you've got to be taught a lot. He's got to be a bit tougher with you in a fatherly sense. And he withdraws his help. And it's when he withdraws his help from you that you understand that others are suffering in the world. Because you've suffered, and as John Paul II says, the painful nights, because you've suffered, maybe, we understand there are others suffering in the world. And we understand that we have to then go and help them. And when we put everything into balance, and we've got the purgative, the dark night of the senses, the illuminative, the dark night of the spirit, into the unitive, we put all these things in balance, and we understand through this that God is taking himself away from us so that we understand that others are suffering in the world. And it's not just that some people are active and some people are contemplative. It's more that we are contemplatives in the world. And some people will be more contemplative and some people will be more active. But you've still got to go through the path. And when we do this, we will start loving our neighbour. And I'm not being judgmental. I'm not saying that certain people don't love their neighbour. But just imagine if people went all the way through this path and there was more, over the next 10 or 20 years, more people launched themselves into this path. Just think of that love of neighbour would be in 20 years' time, 10 years' time. Yeah. And this is what's going to basically heal the church. This is what's going to stop the crisis.
Yeah, because
I'll shut up now.
No, it's fascinating.
That's
I could listen to you for hours because you really challenged a lot of ideas, and there's many people in the church who have noted this same theme pulling through. If we look at Pope Francis, Pope Francis wants, he wants to renew the faith. He wants. He deeply wants us to go out and evangelize and to love the poor. And there's no doubt about it. It comes through in all of his teaching. He wants us to, but my impression sometimes is he forgets in order for us to do this as Christ did this, we have to be transformed by Christ. We have to go through that purgative stage, which is a conversion. It's a renouncement of sin. And all of the spiritual masters and the fathers of the church, you read it in the Philokalia, you read it in the doctors of the church, the Carmelite doctors, there is recognize what is disordered, sinful in our life, because so that we follow the divine order, and we are transformed by Christ, and then the fruits come out that the church is so looking for. The crisis in the church is we're not guiding people to the purgative state, even to the entry to the purgative stage. That's my assessment of the crisis in the church, that we have become moral therapeutic deists. You know, our homilies or our talks are about ecology and different topics, but there is very little on this topic of introducing people into the spiritual life. And it's on both sides of the church, because you said at the beginning, on the traditional side, it can be very manual. Okay, read the catechism and confess your sins and be in a state of grace. Hold on a second. The spiritual life is far deeper than just knowing the faith. It's union with somebody who deeply loves us. Um, and I don't think the church fully understands how far off track it is with opening souls to union with God. It really is off track at this moment in time. On in the leadership in the church just do not see this, don't understand it. You speak to them and it's like you're talking double Dutch to them. Yeah, very pious idea, Robert, but I can't implement this in my parish. People won't understand it. That's too mystical. That's for all these saints. And actually, it's the ordinary state of the spiritual life is union with God. There is no other way. Exists nothing in the Catholic Church other than this deep union with somebody who loves us, that wants to love us, that we will then go out and share that with those around us. I mean, I can't think of any other way around this crisis other than going back into that path of theosis.
Well, yeah, so you mentioned a couple of things there. Firstly, about Pope Francis, um, and then that the church is not teaching this. Well, let's just be, what I'll do is, rather than go down any argumentative routes, what I'll say is, we'll give just for a second, we'll just give the church a break. And,
Yeah.
And what we'll say is that, well, maybe the Holy Spirit has a plan. Maybe these charismatic stage initiatives are not such a bad thing for the church, because there are plenty of people, including people who go to the Latin Mass, if they hadn't have gone through something to do with the new evangelization, they maybe never would have. I'm going to use the phrase relationship, having a personal relationship with Jesus. Well, the thing is that it's not true that this is just a Protestant concept. It's a patristic concept. It's once against, you could mention any number of the patristic fathers, but we'll mention Augustine. You do have to have this relationship. So maybe we need to think of it that maybe the Holy Spirit has a plan, maybe God has got a plan, and maybe things needed shaking up. And we've had the charismatic stage initiatives, and that's all the bishops can deal with at the minute, because even getting that in place wasn't easy. It's not everywhere. And then maybe, God has got a plan that it will now open up this, because that's what I see. Because we talk about different people who are teaching this in the church, and this is basically, it's all bubbling under the surface. So maybe God knows what he's doing, and it will be a shock for the bishops at first that they've got to deal with something, but this is going to come through the grassroots. It's going to be people saying, well, this is they people already know that this is sort of. I mean, even the traditionalists, they've come across Father Gary Lagrange. They've got to be careful because you can't take 3,000 words and just conceptualize it and think I'm going to do the 3 stages of spiritual life. You can't conceptualize 3,000 words. We have to have sensible ways of teaching it, balanced, pastoral, and this pastoral is correct. It's got to be underpinned with some spiritual direction as well. But the way into it is not just to think about this. I'm going to practice the virtues, and that, though you must, obviously practice the virtues. The way into this is thinking that I've got to enter God's passive will for us. So what we do is we do our part, the active, but we've got to then let go, and we've got to let God do his passive part. And we say, right, God, I've done as much as I can. It's obviously not working. I've not stopped mortal sin, or I haven't stopped venial sin, and I've still got these problems. And so what I'm doing, so I'm fighting it. And then you basically, as John of the Cross says, he says that most people don't go through this path because they don't enter the dark. They're too scared to enter the dark night of the senses. Now, we have to balance this out with a teaching by Father Tauler, which is mentioned in Father Gary Lagrange and other places, that not everybody's going to get this tough. You don't have to be scared of going into the dark night of the senses, because some people just have dryness in prayer, or dryness, aridity in prayer, and a fight against sin, a trial against sin. And for there's 3 levels. There's some people have this more easily because maybe they're good souls already, and they don't need such a hard, God the Father to be so hard. But then for the middle section, they're going to be tested a lot because they've got maybe, God the Father has to, show that fatherly love and, really get them to a really firm amendment of life. And for the highest level be those who are put through trials in life as well.
Yeah.
But for the majority, the mystical theologians tend to say for the majority, it's just going to be these hard trials in prayer and aridity in prayer and sin. But what we have to do is, when we sort of get to the end of the purgative stage, we've got to say, I've done everything I can. I've basically amended my life. I'm not committing mortal sin anymore. There might be the odd mistake. And now it's over to you, God. And you've basically just got to say, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. It doesn't, but you have to have balance in this as well. You can't just say, well, now one of the biggest mistakes that is made is confusing the will of God with God has got a plan for me. If people do that, things are going wrong, and you can see this has actually come out of the charismatic movement. God's will is your sanctification, and this is number 1. And then the other stuff, God will sort out. Yeah. So if you actually follow what the scriptures say, if you want this deep peace, if you want all these things that are promised in the Bible, you've got to stop sinning. It's as simple as that. You basically get rid of mortal sin. In the purgative stage, you get rid of venial sin, as much venial sin as is possible, because there'll still be some in the unitive stage, but as much as possible in the illuminative stage. But you've basically got to allow God to take over. You don't put yourself in stupid positions, so you disrupt your life and you do stupid things that can put you in difficult situations. It's about loving God. It's about really knuckling down, stopping the sin. Because really, what the bishops are not saying is, you've got to stop. It's got to stop. And the church, and we've got to think: are the bishops acting patristically? Because the church fathers, the patristic era, they preach the milk of the teaching of the milk, and the teaching of what they tend to say of meat. But that meat really is, you've got to stop sinning. And by the end of the, getting halfway through the illuminative stage, you should really only be committing venial sin. And as you go further on, you're like, you'd be really annoyed if you were committing venial sin. So this is really what it's about. And the bishops, I think it's going to be a grassroots thing. Obviously, I tried to start teaching it. There are people that Dan Burke, Ralph Martin. I mean, and I would caution, give some, tell the treds to be cautious, because it's not coming out of the traditional movement list. It's actually coming out of the Novus Ordo Church.
Correct.
And this is the truth. We have to have some integrity. We've got to have some honesty. That this actually came out. These teachings really started through the Novus. I don't mean to call it Novus Ordo Church, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it's those people who are teaching it. The person you're dealing with, Jean Curry in Ireland. Yeah. I'm pretty much sure that's the same for him.
Exactly the same.
It's about humility.
Yes.
Now, I really want the traditional movement to take this on. That's what I'm about, really. I really want to say the traditional movement have got to take this on. I really think, because we've got people who are genuinely trying in the traditional movement. They want to amend their life. And we've got the traditionalist priests saying, they're going to confession, they're trying, they're really getting stuck into amending their lives. And we've got to believe this. And I do think that, we've basically got to get the traditional movement on this. And there is a word warning that already there are sort of esoteric mystical medieval teachings coming out, because what they don't want to do is admit that any of this modern stuff is correct. Yeah. And so what they're doing is we're going to have our own version, but be warned, because if you go down that esoteric mystical route, you're going to get yourself tangled up in knots, because you don't need to. We've had 2,000 years, and I say this, whether you go to New Mass, Latin Mass, we've had 2,000 years. We've got the Desert Fathers, we've got the Church Fathers, we've got the Doctors of the Church through medieval times, and then it all ends up with Lagrange, Arentero, Tancred, and we need to it's about wisdom. Where do you take wisdom from? Well, you take wisdom from everywhere. John Paul II was right in Novo Millennium. Are you all right with me just carrying on just for a second?
Yeah, keep going. Yeah.
So traditionalists, we have to say, well, maybe the Pope sometimes made mistakes, but also they got things right. I do want to mention John Paul II. Novo Millennium Nunte, clearly, once you've analysed it, he talks about the dark night twice, and he even mentions the painful night. And why? Because we know he went through the dark night. He went through both of them. The reason he was able to do his ministry when he was on the world stage and he was ill all the way up to old age is because he was at union with God. There's no point people saying, and if we're going to be honest, if you say, well, he made mistakes, well, maybe maybe he hadn't quite reached the unitive stage. I don't know, but there are reasons, but in the end, he was at union with God, and I don't think you'll find many people in Poland who say different, including spiritual theologians that I know. Novo Millennium and Nunte got this right, and of course, this is why it's coming through the mainstream church, the Novus Ordo, with people, because they understood this. I think that John Paul II obviously had a Carmelite background at Wadowice. I'd love to talk to you one day about Poland, maybe another time. I don't know, maybe another time. But
I lived in Krakow, so I know about Poland. Yeah,
he learned this from St. Joseph's Seminary. This path in Wadowice, one of the most amazing places I've ever been. I mean, I've been to all the amazing places in Poland. I lived there basically. It's just the most amazing place to live. And I've got to be careful I don't get off track. So, and can I just say one final thing? Because this is really important. It's also important for the traditionalists to hear. We can get very arrogant about what we think when we think we're doing things right. Well, John Paul II mentioned that Noah Huta was the place where the new evangelization was meant to be based on. And nobody ever talks about this. And what happened was, we've had all these, the new evangelization and these, and that's to do with the charismatic stage. But when you look at Noah Huta, it didn't have anything to do with the charismatic stage. Nothing at all. It had to do with peasant piety. And these peasants were forced to go to Noah Huta, and they had their peasant piety. Now, some of them did become corrupted because the communist gave them cheap alcohol and cheap access to all sorts of bad behavior and communist behavior. But a lot of them didn't. They kept with the peasant piety, and they fought for their church. And we've got to ask, there were 20,000 troops there, and they kept putting the cross kept being ripped down by the communists, and they kept putting it up every night. Well, this is not something of the charismatic stage. And what it was peasant piety, because they were formed in nature. They were formed in the hardships of life. They worked in the fields. They had to put up with something that, minus 10, I've tried to get a little bit of it by, going out, in winter, minus 10, being absolutely frozen. But they, in those days, it was like minus 30, but they still had to go to work. And the virtues were perfected to some degree with us. And they practiced the faith. Now, we must stop now, because the point is that it doesn't matter who you are, charismatic, traditional, conservative in the church. This doesn't exist in the West. Peasant piety doesn't exist. We don't have those conditions. We have central heating. We have comfy. So we cannot emulate. So when traditionalists talk about we're going to be like medieval people, they're not, because they were not formed, they're not being formed with the peasant piety in the same way as those people were. And so we don't have those conditions. So how are we going to impose those conditions of the peasant piety on ourselves? Because it's impossible. We could go and live in the desert, or we could actually literally go somewhere like Siberia, but we're probably not going to do that. So what are we going to do? Well, we've got this framework, and it's called the 3 stages of the spiritual life. And it is true that before Vatican II, you are going on this path. But yes, if you learn it in a pastoral way, that you understand what the times and seasons are of this path, then you will start putting yourself into this sort of spiritual poverty of these peasants, because you will start denying yourself. You will start aligning yourself with God's will, and basically, because we don't have the peasant piety, we don't really have. We're not even getting the correct teaching, if we're being honest. Even if without this path. So we need this path now to restore the church, restore the faith, restore the family, restore the world. Yeah. And we need to restore the church. Yeah. And that's basically what it boils down to.
Yeah, I did hear in a podcast once by Father Rippinger, and he was talking about the fact that, in the traditional Latin Mass and the traditional movement, because they preach on sin, because they have a good routine of confession, because they have good pious masses, that all of this environment would naturally lead souls on this process of union with God. I mean, that the earth is cultivated, because again, we're not here to bash anybody in the church on this, but to try and give some pointers out of love for the church on where we go after the crisis. I think it's how do we bring the whole church around us to come together on this need to return to this deep living tradition in the church?
Okay, well, let me start with Pope Francis. Okay, I understand that there's issues there, but I have to say, in the Cult of Holiness, he does understand this. And one of the things I just want to launch into this with is that he talks about how he says exactly the same as Edith Stein, that we are following the life of Christ in a mystical way. And what I would say is, if there are, I don't, I'm probably not bishops listening, but if there's anybody in the church who's listening, like priests, you do not have to be scared about putting this into place in the church, because it's in Vatican II. Union with God, it says it in Vatican II. Christian perfection, it says it in Vatican II. How can you be against the church and put things into the church if it's in Vatican II? You can't say you can't put it in, because it's in Vatican II. So there's nothing to be scared of. And it's also in Novo Millennio Annunte. And basically, John Paul II, before, during, and at the end of his pontificate, and it specifically says at the end, in Novo Millennio Annunte, he wants this in every community in the world.
Yeah.
And so you've got to document that.
Yeah.
You actually have a document, a church document by what, let's face it, a beloved Pope.
Yeah.
Somebody actually said, a good priest friend of mine actually said, we're sort of orphans of John Paul II in many ways. and I think there's some truth to this,
Yeah,
and I hope even the traditionalists, who came up through this, he was at union with God. He said the right things in the end. He said, and before I forget, Benedict backs him up. He says all the answers are in this Christological methods set out in Novo Millennio Annunte.
Yeah.
So there cannot be a bishop or a priest or a religious on the planet who could be scared of this, because these words are in Vatican II,
but
they're in Novo Millennio Annunte.
They're incredibly afraid to propose this path of sanctification to the world. I mean, in Catholic schools, they are afraid to teach the Decalogue because maybe a child, it comes from a family that's divorced, and they're actually afraid to propose the Christian way of perfection to the world. They are afraid to use the pulpit to propose the Christian way of perfection. It's just leave people where they are, which is why they're drifting away from the church, because they've never encountered Christ. And there's this Italian mystic that I've been reading for the last number of years, Maria Valtorta, divides in the church, but this woman, her genius for whatever reason, and she talks about Christ, constantly calling people to this Christian way of perfection. Don't judge, love your neighbor, again and again and again and again. And he wasn't this fluffy hippie guy that forgave everybody and cured anybody that touched him. He definitely wasn't. He was very direct in calling those around him to change, to convert, to become like a child. Going back, you've mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast. This should be the bread and butter of what we do as Catholics, to call people to the conversion, to this way of perfection, which is incredible. It's an incredible journey of spiritual life.
I think one of the things I'd say is that I think when we were children, we might remember a time when we were good children, and we knew there was something good about us and something good in us. And then we'd also recognize that we got corrupted. And for all the naysayers, and there will be, we can't teach this and we can't say that. But what they're actually doing is keeping people in misery.
Yes.
Because the Bible teaches about peace. And although not all the bad is going to be taken away, there is going to be an inner peace that's restored. And one of the things I just, like to mention is that it can be mentioned like this, that when people start going back to that point where, oh, I don't sin anymore, or I don't commit this mortal sin. And then you're cutting down on venial sin. And there's a point that maybe people would get to where they're amazed because they become this good person again. And some of that piece is to do with that. Oh, I'm not a corrupt person in the world, causing this sort of knock-on effect to hurt other people. And actually, something good has been restored in me. And actually, and some of this union with God aspect is about, sensing that peace, through the fact that we have become that little child.
Yeah.
And of course we've got all the problems of being adults, but we can deal with that. We can deal with that. But I think the challenge is this: if you go past the homeless person in the street and you're going to mass and you go past them, then you're not doing what Jesus said. I mean, even Teresa of Avila says that, with Martha and Mary, it wasn't about contemplation. It wasn't that, Mary was a contemplative. Teresa of Avila says this. It's like, it's not that we just get so focused on the mass that we think we're loving God. We actually have to do what God says. We have,
Yeah.
And what I find is what I would say is that people don't have to be scared of this either, because God knows us. And so it's not that all of a sudden you're going to be bombarded with 50 homeless people when you go into town. God knows what you can deal with. I'm using homeless people as an example. There could be other good examples. It's just a standard example. But by using the virtue, you will go up to them. You will give them you won't just throw some money at them. You'll get some food for them. You'll talk to them. You'll shake their hand. And I'm just using that as one example. But this is expected of us every time. Now, I know sometimes we have bad days, and maybe we haven't got the money, or we're with us or something. But that's basically what's expected of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's getting the balance right. It's restoring the divine order and putting the balance right. And there is not, I'm sorry, but I just want to say there's not a bishop or a priest that can be scared of this. How can they be scared of it?
Yeah.
How can it be a threat for them when it's in Vatican II and Novo Millennio Inunte? Because the bottom line is that it's, how can you have a document that's been ignored for 50 years? So let's hope that the Holy Spirit has had a plan, and he's got, he's taught us how to love God in a way through these charismatic stage initiatives, that we've got this, what St. Augustine says is this relationship with God, this sort of loving relationship with God. And St. Alphonsus Liguori talks about, talking to Jesus as a friend. He says that. It's not some Protestant thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
These things have been put in place, and now's the time to move forward and get this mess cleaned up.
Yeah. I think
basically cleaning this mess up.
Yeah.
And and if they don't start seeing it, it's just going to go on for another 50 years.
Yeah. Well, I hope this conversation it serves as some type of pointers, thinkers on this. And again, we're not here to divide the church. We're just here to help, to renew the faith.
It's not possible to divide the church on this thing. It is literally
no.
It's the divine order.
Yeah, I know.
It is literally how to restore the divine order. It's the one thing that's going to heal all the division.
Yeah.
So we need all the liberals, all the conservatives, all the trabs, all the charismatics. We need them all of them. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You can't divide the church with this, because this is going to bring it, and it's also going to restore unity with the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting. It's interesting. I did a Cursillo weekend last year, and I thought the whole weekend was actually a miniature introducing people to three ways of the spiritual life, because they start the first evening, and I don't want to talk too much about it because it was so nice, but they started it, on the confession side, the repentance side, and then they're leading people through the whole. It's a miniature catechesis. But I have met some people in the Cursillo movement that are really, I mean, there's no doubt about it, they really understand this concept of union with God. Like they do the Cursillo weekend, and they go out to homeless shelters, and they're bringing people in, I mean, in their simple way, because God is working through it. And it really questioned me a lot. It really drove a lot of questions in my mind. Looking at how they were working. And this was a movement that was started before Vatican II was started back in the 40s in Spain. And actually from there, Kiko Arguello, the neo-catechumenals, came out of there. He did a weekend on this. But I honestly do think, as you said, this can't divide the church, but this has to be brought out. It has to be taught. We need teachers to lead, to catechize, to inflame in us this desire to embark on this path of holiness, which is the ordinary state of the spiritual life. It's the ordinary. This is the way we should be as Catholics. It's not optional. I think we're selling ourselves so short at the moment in the church.
That's it. And just one final thing I do want to mention, because I'm going to say it now, that we've got something called RCIA.
Yeah.
And on the fourth part, or it certainly was before, the fourth part was called mystagogy.
Yeah.
Mystagogy. Well, this seems to be a but it's a mystagogy,
A
but
missed
without any.
opportunity.
It's a missed opportunity, because mystagogy means, mystical theology. There's a reason the word is there, and it's not me having a go. It's actually RCIA teachers are saying, well, we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And what they do is they cobble something together, and they say, well, we know this isn't right, but we've just got to cobble something together. And Stratford Caldecott, who was a theologian philosopher, it's in the book, it's in the first book I did, but he actually says that there's the three stages. And John Paul II has taught, it basically implies this. He doesn't say it's got to be an RCIA, but the obvious thing is it's already there. It's like they actually use the name mystagogy.
Yeah.
So if you want the answer, that's the answer.
Yeah.
It can just basically be the end part of RCIA.
Yeah.
Just as an introduction.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we have to leave it here because I'm on the clock. But I hope this will be the first of a few interviews, and people can leave their comments below so that we can develop them out. But it's a theme that has come out by various people in the church: Dan Burke, Jean Curie, David Torkington, yourself, and it's I see it in different areas, and really now it's time for the church to listen now, and understand this is the solution. Christ is the solution to our crisis. And we can't sidestep this process in the church, or downplay it, or wash it down. This is it. This is the solution. And hopefully some great theologians and priests and bishops out there might listen to what the Holy Spirit is definitely working in the laity now. There's no doubt about it, Michael. I am absolutely convinced our Holy Spirit is working in the laity in an unprecedented way, like never before seen in the church. And this should be a call to our leadership. You need to lead us now on this process again, and not be afraid to call us to this high level of mysticism, which is the ordinary state of the spiritual life, the universal cult of holiness. Yeah.
And well, I'll just finish by saying, let's just all get on with it.
Yeah,
exactly. Because that's what's got to happen. It just doesn't matter what part of the church you're in, you've just got to get on with it now.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's the truth, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, but I think there are good things ahead for the church if it happens.
Yeah, I absolutely do.
we talk about the prophecy of Benedict. I know he had slightly differently, but he thought about a smaller, purer church. Well, where's it going to come from? Well, this is the only solution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Union with God is the only solution.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
No problem. Look, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Michael, and hopefully we'll be able to do another future videos. And again,
It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, I'm going to put a link to your books in this video as well. So if anybody's interested in buying some of your books on this topic, because they may interest people. You have a wealth of knowledge. It's certainly, you haven't just skimmed over this. You've really studied this, which I find interesting, and hopefully this will drive a bigger conversation in the church.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. God bless.
Have a good day, Robert. All the best. God bless.
Bye-bye.